The doctor told her she was 3 months pregnant. It's impossible, since she'd only met the Vampire King 3 weeks ago. Her hands trembled over the ultrasound print. What no one knew, vampire gestation collapsed time itself, and the council watching through the clinic's glass already considered her womb a political weapon. Clara stared at the ultrasound image until her vision blurred, the grainy black and white curves forming shapes that made no sense according to every scientific principle she had ever learned. Dr. Rivera stood beside her with trembling hands, the paper rustling between her fingers like dead leaves in autumn wind. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that always gave Clara headaches during late-night lab sessions, but now the sound felt accusatory, as though even the electrical current knew she had somehow broken the fundamental laws of biology. She blinked hard and forced her mind into the familiar territory of empirical analysis. 3 weeks ago, she had attended the gala at the Museum of Natural History, one of those tedious fundraising events where wealthy humans and influential vampires mingled under crystal chandeliers while pretending the Treaty of Montreal had solved centuries of mutual suspicion and bloodshed. She had volunteered because the research grant her lab desperately needed required community engagement hours, not because she enjoyed small talk with immortals who remembered plague years and religious wars as though discussing last summer's vacation. The numbers refused to reconcile themselves. 12 weeks of fetal development could not occur in 21 calendar days. She was a medical researcher specializing in reproductive genetics. She knew gestation timelines the way other people knew their own birthdays. This was impossible. Dr. Rivera cleared her throat, the sound harsh and frightened in the small examination room. "We need to run the test again," Clara said, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. "There must be contamination in the sample or a calibration error with the ultrasound equipment. These things happen." The doctor shook her head slowly, her dark eyes fixed on something Clara could not see. "I ran it 3 times already. Before you came in, the results are consistent." Clara felt her left wrist begin to burn with cold fire. That strange sensation she had noticed this morning when brushing her teeth, but dismissed as nerve irritation from sleeping in an awkward position. She looked down and saw for the first time the faint silver pattern spiraling across her skin, like frost forming on winter glass, delicate and intricate and utterly alien. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Her breath caught. That was not there yesterday. She touched the mark with her right hand, and the cold intensified, spreading up her arm in waves that made her muscles clench. The gala rushed back to her in fragments. She had been examining a display of medieval medical instruments when Victor Castellane appeared beside her, moving with that preternatural silence vampires possessed. He had commented on a particular surgical tool, explaining its actual historical use versus the museum's incorrect placard, and she found herself drawn into conversation, despite her general wariness around his kind. He spoke about 13th century anatomical texts with the casual authority of someone who had read them when they were new, and she forgot to maintain the polite distance humans usually kept from vampire royalty. They danced once, his hand cool and firm against her back, and she felt dizzy in a way that had nothing to do with the champagne she had not drunk. On the balcony overlooking the city lights, he traced her wrist with one finger and whispered words in a language that sounded like wind through ancient forests. And she went home early with her head spinning and her thoughts scattered like startled birds. Dr. Rivera moved to the window and her entire body went rigid. "You need to leave," she said quietly. "Now. Do not go home." Clara stood, confusion giving way to alarm at the doctor's tone. "What are you talking about?" The physician pointed toward the parking lot visible through the blinds without turning around. "Those 2 men in the dark suits. They have been watching this building since you arrived. I recognize their posture. Palace guards." Clara's scientific detachment crumbled into something rawer and more primitive. She looked where Dr. Rivera indicated and saw them, two figures standing beside a black sedan with the particular stillness that marked trained security personnel. She had seen that same watchful stance at the gala, vampires who moved through the crowd like sharks through water, always aware of threats and exits and angles of approach. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration jarring against her hip. She pulled it out with numb fingers and read the message from an unknown number. The council requests your immediate presence. A car is waiting. This is not optional. Panic flared bright and sharp. She looked at Dr. Rivera, at the ultrasound image still clutched in the physician's shaking hands, at the silver mark on her wrist that burned like ice. Then she grabbed her jacket and ran. The parking garage was dim and echoed with her footsteps as she sprinted toward her old sedan parked in the far corner. She fumbled with her keys, her hands slick with sweat despite the cold fire still spreading from her wrist. She had the door half open when two figures appeared on either side of her car, manifesting from shadows with the impossible speed that still made humans gasp even 6 years after the treaty. One was male, one female, both wearing those same dark suits and expressions of polite implacability. "Miss Morrison," the woman said, her voice courteous and utterly inflexible. "Please come with us. His Majesty is concerned for your well-being." Clara backed against her car door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I do not consent to this. You cannot legally detain a human citizen without cause." The male guard tilted his head slightly, and she saw the faint glow in his eyes. That meant he was very old and very powerful. "We are not detaining you. We are escorting you. There is a difference. The Council has invoked emergency protocols regarding supernatural human biological anomalies. You fall under those protocols as of 20 minutes ago, when your physician filed a mandatory report." Betrayal stung sharp and bitter. Dr. Rivera had reported her. Of course she had. Medical professionals were legally required to notify authorities of any supernatural incidents that might pose public health risks. A human woman pregnant with what could only be a vampire hybrid would definitely qualify. She wanted to argue, to demand legal representation, to insist on her rights under the treaty. But the guards moved closer with that predatory patience vampires had perfected over millennia, and she knew with cold certainty that she had no choice in this moment. She could scream, she could fight, she could try to run, none of it would matter. She got into the car. The interior smelled of leather and something else, something old and faintly metallic that made her skin prickle. The female guard drove while the male sat beside Clara in the back seat, not touching her but positioned to intercept any attempt at escape. They pulled smoothly out of the garage into afternoon traffic, and Clara forced herself to breathe slowly and think. Impossible pregnancy. Accelerated gestation. The Vampire King's touch. She remembered Victor's eyes at the gala, ancient and lonely despite the careful control he maintained over every expression. She remembered feeling dizzy when he whispered those foreign words, as though reality had shifted slightly sideways and left her unmoored. Her scientific training warred with the evidence burning cold on her wrist. They drove through the city, and Clara watched the streets pass with new eyes. Vampires and humans moved among each other in the usual careful dance of coexistence, neither fully trusting, but both bound by treaties and laws that were still being tested daily. They passed a checkpoint where human police and vampire enforcers worked side by side, checking identification and watching for signs of treaty violations. A group of protesters stood on the corner holding signs. "Blood rights equal human blight. No Fang justice." The usual slogans from those who believed the treaty had been a mistake, that humans and vampires should have remained separate species living in separate worlds. Another group across the street held counter-protest signs. "Integration now. One species, two bloods." The optimists who thought interspecies cooperation was humanity's evolutionary path forward. Clara had always considered herself firmly in the scientific camp. neither optimist nor pessimist, but realist who dealt in evidence and data. Now she was evidence. She was data. She was the thing both sides would use to prove their arguments, while caring nothing for her actual survival. The Nightfall spire rose ahead of them, a renovated Art Deco skyscraper that served as the Vampire Court's headquarters in this territory. She had expected something gothic, all stone towers and iron gates, but Victor had chosen to house his government in a building that looked like it belonged on a corporate skyline. The windows were floor-to-ceiling UV filtering glass that let in light without the lethal radiation that would incinerate younger vampires. Marble and gold decorated the exterior in patterns that were elegant without being ostentatious. They parked in an underground garage that had more security than most military installations and took a private elevator that rose so smoothly Clara's stomach barely registered the motion. The doors opened onto a waiting area that looked nothing like she expected. There were other people here, humans and vampires both, sitting in comfortable chairs and speaking quietly with assistants who took notes on tablets. A woman in a business suit was explaining asylum requirements to a vampire who looked terrified and exhausted. A human businessman argued with a clerk about trade permits for supernatural goods across treaty borders. This was not a throne room. This was a functioning government office, bureaucratic and efficient, and utterly mundane in its operation. Clara sat in a chair that cost more than her monthly rent and tried to process what was happening. A woman approached her, tall and pale with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She moved with the controlled grace of something very old wearing a human shape, and her eyes held centuries of experience filtered through careful neutrality. "Miss Morrison," she said, "I am Isolde, Chief Advisor to His Majesty. He has been concerned about your well-being since the gala. We have been searching for you." Clara stood, anger finally burning through her fear. "Searching for me? I have been at work and home for 3 weeks. I am not exactly hiding." Isolde's expression did not change. "His Majesty did not wish to alarm you by contacting you directly. He was hoping the situation would resolve itself naturally. It has not. Now we must proceed according to protocols." "What situation?" Clara demanded. "What protocols?" "You will address those questions to the king," Isolde said calmly. "And only the king." She gestured toward a set of double doors that looked like they belonged in a palace, all carved wood and brass fittings. Clara wanted to refuse, to demand her rights, to insist on legal counsel. But her wrist burned with silver fire, and her body carried an impossible pregnancy, and she was so far beyond the realm of normal legal protections that arguing felt like shouting at a hurricane. She walked through the doors. The room beyond was large but not cavernous, designed for functionality rather than intimidation. Windows overlooked the city in 3 directions. A long table dominated one side, clearly for council meetings and negotiations. And at the far end, in a modern chair that looked comfortable rather than throne-like, sat Victor Castellane. He stood when he saw her, and something in his carefully controlled expression cracked open for just a moment. Real emotion flickered across his face, relief and fear and something else she could not name. "Clara," he said, and his voice carried weight that made the air feel heavier. "Thank the old gods you are safe." She stared at him across the polished floor and felt the silver mark on her wrist pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Safe," she repeated. "I am being held against my will by your guards after receiving a pregnancy diagnosis that violates every known law of biology. Safe is not the word I would choose." Victor's jaw tightened, and she saw him struggle with something internal, some battle between what he wanted to say and what his position allowed him to say. "Please sit," he said finally. "This will be easier if you are sitting." She remained standing. "Explain the pregnancy," she said flatly. "Now." For a moment, she thought he might refuse, might hide behind diplomatic language and political necessity. Then something in him shifted, and she saw the man beneath the king, the person who had discussed medieval medical texts with genuine enthusiasm and danced with her like it mattered. When he spoke, his voice was clinical, almost detached, but she heard the emotional turmoil underneath. Vampire conception operates on resonance rather than linear time, he said. When a true bond forms between a vampire and a human, the body recognizes it instantly at a cellular level. Gestation follows a supernatural timeline. 12 weeks of human development can occur in 3 weeks of calendar time because the bond compresses temporal, biological processes. Clara's scientific mind seized on the explanation like a lifeline. A bond. What kind of bond? Victor met her eyes, and she saw centuries of loneliness looking back at her. A mating bond, he said quietly. The kind that has not occurred in over 400 years. The kind that my people thought was extinct. The kind that is now politically catastrophic because the last time it happened, the resulting child nearly destroyed the balance between our species. She felt the floor tilt beneath her feet and grabbed the back of a chair for support. The last bonded birth, Victor continued in that same clinical tone. The child possessed abilities that made her a target for radicals on both sides. Vampires who wanted to study her, humans who wanted to weaponize her. She was 12 years old when she was murdered by those who feared her power. After that, the council established Protocol Nightshade. Any bonded pregnancy must be presented within 48 hours of discovery. The council determines whether the child is permitted to be born based on projected power levels and political risk assessment. Clara's hands gripped the chair so hard her knuckles went white. They decide if my baby lives or dies. Victor's expression was carved from stone, but his eyes betrayed him. I am king, he said, but I am bound by laws older than my reign. The council convenes tomorrow night. I will argue for you, for our child. It was the first time he said our, and the word hung in the air between them like a promise and a threat. If the council rules against us, he continued, you must either undergo termination or go into permanent exile from all vampire territories. I cannot override their decision without triggering civil war. 3 council members already oppose my progressive treaty policies. If I show favoritism to a human carrying my child, they will use it to remove me from power. And if I am removed, the policies that protect mixed species families will be dismantled within weeks. Clara's mind raced through possibilities and outcomes, running calculations the way she did in the lab when experiments went wrong, and she needed to salvage results from chaos. You are telling me I have to let them decide whether my child lives. He moved closer, and she saw real anguish in his face. I am telling you that you have a choice right now. You can run. I will help you disappear, give you resources and contacts in territories beyond council jurisdiction. You will be alone and hunted, but you will be free. Or you can stay and fight the council's ruling. If you stay, you are bound by vampire law until they make their decision. But if you stay, I can argue for you. I can try to change their minds. She looked at him, this ancient creature who ruled a government and commanded loyalty from beings who remembered empires rising and falling. She thought about running, about spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder while raising a child who would never be safe. She thought about her life before this moment, years spent in laboratories and libraries, building a career from nothing because she had been orphaned at 12 and learned early that the only person she could rely on was herself. She thought about the impossible pregnancy growing inside her, the child who should not exist but did, the family she had never thought she would have. I stay, she said. Victor's relief was visible for just a moment before he locked it down behind royal composure. Then you are under council jurisdiction as of this moment. I will do everything in my power to protect you and our child. But Clara, you need to understand what you are facing. These are vampires who have survived for over a millennium by being ruthless in their risk assessment. They will not be swayed by emotion or moral arguments. They care only about survival of our species and maintenance of the treaty. You are asking them to gamble the entire balance of power on an unknown child. She lifted her chin and met his eyes. Then we make them see it is not a gamble. We make them see the data. We make them see that fear is not the same as fact. Before he could respond, the doors opened and Isolde entered without knocking. Her face was carefully blank. "Sire," she said, "Councillor Theron demands immediate audience. He has invoked the right of challenge regarding the human." Victor's expression went cold as winter stone. She saw his hands curl into fists at his sides before he forced them to relax. "Send him in," he said quietly. Clara felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees as Isolde departed. "What is the right of challenge?" she asked. Victor looked at her, and she saw something dark and dangerous in his eyes, the predator beneath the diplomat. "It means Theron is not challenging the pregnancy directly. He is challenging my fitness to rule while emotionally compromised by human entanglement. It means this just became about more than our child. It became about the future of vampire governance in this territory." The doors opened again, and a man entered who made Clara's instincts scream danger. He was tall and angular, with silver hair and eyes like chips of obsidian. He moved with the absolute confidence of something at the top of the food chain, and when he looked at her she felt examined and dismissed in the space of a heartbeat. "Councillor Theron Corvus," Victor said, his voice formal and cold. "You invoke ancient rights. State your challenge." Theron smiled without warmth. "You have bonded with a human," he said, "created a pregnancy that violates protocol nightshade, allowed personal attachment to compromise your political neutrality. I challenge your fitness to rule while emotionally entangled. I call for council review of your authority." Victor did not move, but Clara felt the power gathering around him like static electricity before a lightning strike. "The bond was not chosen," he said. "It formed naturally as bonds did in the old times. To challenge it is to challenge the covenant of blood itself." Theron waved one hand dismissively. "The covenant was written when bonds were common. They are not common now. They are dangerous anomalies that create political weapons. This human carries a child who will be used by factions on both sides. The only safe path is termination and dissolution of the bond." Clara felt ice flood her veins. Dissolution. Victor's face was carved granite. "The covenant honors true bonds above all political considerations. To sever a natural bond is to violate our most fundamental law." Theron pulled an ancient text from his coat, leather-bound and yellow with age. "The dissolution ritual requires consent of both parties," he said. "It erases the pregnancy and severs the connection. Both individuals survive, though diminished. It is the merciful option. It is the safe option." Victor moved between Theron and Clara with speed that blurred the air. "You will not touch her," he said, softly, and his voice carried death in every syllable. "The council will hear this matter," Theron said. "We convene in the chamber, now." Clara found herself moving forward before she consciously decided to do so. "You are debating my body," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "My child. My life. I get a voice in this." Theron turned to look at her fully for the first time, and she saw ancient contempt in his gaze. "You are human," he said. "You have no standing in council matters." "Actually," Clara said, pulling her scientific composure around her like armor, "I am a medical researcher specializing in reproductive genetics. I understand the risks of hybrid births better than anyone in this room, and I propose a compromise." Victor's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing. Theron's expression did not change. A third figure entered the room, a woman with pale blonde hair and ice-blue eyes, who radiated calculating intelligence. "Councillor Marina," Victor said, "we are convening in the chamber." Marina looked at Clara with undisguised curiosity. "What would you have us hear, human?" she asked. Clara took a breath and let her training take over, the same way she presented research findings to skeptical grant committees. You are terrified of the unknown, she said. I understand that. But terror makes terrible policy. I propose you allow the pregnancy to continue under complete monitoring. I will submit to testing, observation, magical safeguards. You will have full scientific documentation of the first bonded birth in centuries. You can gather data that allows you to make informed decisions instead of executing based on fear. Theron's face twisted with rage. You would make yourself a laboratory specimen? I am already a political pawn, Clara said flatly. At least science serves truth. She saw Victor look at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been love, or might have been guilt. She saw Marina lean forward with interest. She saw Theron vibrate with fury. Marina tapped one finger against her chin. The council will deliberate, she said. We convene the full council in 48 hours. Until then, Miss Morrison, you are confined to palace grounds under protective custody. The fate of your pregnancy will be determined by council vote. Currently, we are deadlocked 3-3. The seventh counselor, Lydia, has not yet arrived to cast the deciding vote. Clara felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like chains. She was a prisoner. Her child's life hung on the vote of strangers, and everything depended on convincing ancient vampires that love and science could outweigh fear and tradition. Guards appeared to escort her to guest quarters. As she walked through the palace corridors, she passed a window overlooking the plaza below. Protesters had gathered, both human and vampire, holding signs and chanting slogans. One sign read, "Human breeders contaminate the bloodline," in harsh red letters, another across the way read, "Protect the hybrid, end vampire tyranny," in defiant blue. She stood between them, claimed by both sides and cared for by neither. She was a symbol now, a rallying point for ideologies that would use her and discard her without a second thought. She touched the silver mark on her wrist and felt the cold fire pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. Somewhere in this building, Victor was preparing to argue for their child's life. Somewhere beyond these walls, the seventh counselor was traveling to cast a vote that would determine everything. And inside her body, impossible and real, a pregnancy continued that should not exist according to every law of nature she had ever studied. She was a scientist. She dealt in evidence and data and reproducible results. But she was also a mother now, carrying a child who deserved a chance to live regardless of politics or prophecy or ancient fears. She would fight for that chance with every tool she possessed, scientific rigor and maternal fury and desperate hope. Outside the window, the protesters chanted and the city continued its uneasy dance of coexistence. Clara turned away from the glass and followed the guards deeper into the nightfall spire, into the heart of vampire power, into the battle that would decide whether her impossible child would ever draw breath in this dangerous and divided world. The quarters they gave Clara were designed to seduce rather than imprison, all cream silk curtains and furniture that belonged in museum catalogs, but the floor-to-ceiling windows were locked, and guards stood outside her door with the patient stillness of predators who had all the time in the world. She stood at the glass looking down at the city 20 floors below, watching headlights trace patterns through streets where humans and vampires negotiated their uneasy coexistence, and she felt the isolation settle into her bones, like winter cold. The first night alone was the worst, because her mind would not stop running calculations and worst-case scenarios, spinning through possibilities like a centrifuge separating fear from logic and finding precious little logic remaining. She talked to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, outlining her situation the way she would present a research problem to a graduate seminar, trying to force order onto chaos through the discipline of scientific method. The silver mark on her wrist pulsed faintly when she touched it, warmer now than the cold fire it had burned with in the clinic, and as she traced the intricate pattern, she realized with a start that she could feel Victor's presence somewhere in the building, not clearly but directionally, the way a compass needle knows magnetic north. The sensation was impossible to describe in conventional terms, a sixth sense that had not existed before the gala, but now felt as natural as proprioception, and it disturbed her that her body was changing in ways she could not measure or control. The tablet they provided had internet access, but she assumed every search was monitored, every click recorded and analyzed by whatever security systems guarded vampire secrets. So she researched carefully, looking for academic papers on supernatural biology and historical accounts of vampire bonding practices. The fragments she found were frustratingly vague, hedged with qualifiers and contradicted by competing theories. But the consistent thread was that true bonds developed empathic connections over time, gradual intimacy built through years of proximity and shared experience. She should not be feeling Victor this strongly after 3 weeks and one conversation, should not have this directional awareness of his location and emotional state, unless the pregnancy was accelerating everything the way it accelerated gestation itself. She was reading a particularly dense analysis of bonding neurochemistry when she felt his presence growing stronger, coming closer, and she was on her feet before she heard the quiet knock at her door. Victor entered carrying a case of medical equipment, moving with the controlled precision of someone trying very hard not to frighten her, and his voice was carefully neutral when he asked if he could check on her and the child. She let him in because she needed information more than she needed pride, and she watched as he set up a portable ultrasound machine with hands that trembled just slightly, the first sign of vulnerability she had seen in his otherwise perfect composure. He had learned obstetrics decades ago, he explained as he prepared the equipment, back when vampire physicians studied human medicine to better understand the species they lived alongside, and his clinical detachment could not quite hide the terror underneath as he applied conducting gel to her abdomen and positioned the ultrasound wand with exquisite gentleness. The heartbeat filled the room, impossibly strong and fast, and Clara watched Victor's face transform as he stared at the screen, watched centuries of control crack open to reveal something raw and desperate. "She is fighting to exist," he whispered, and Clara heard him say she before her conscious mind registered the pronoun, heard the gender reveal slip out on a breath of wonder and fear. "You can tell already," she said, and he nodded without taking his eyes from the screen, explained that vampire senses detected the child's essence the way human noses detected perfume, that he felt their daughter's power signature mixed with Clara's life force, and something else he did not recognize, some element that was neither human nor vampire, but entirely new. Clara asked about his past then, needing to understand this man whose child she carried, needing context for the fear she saw in his eyes, and Victor spoke haltingly about a human life 800 years ago, about plague taking his wife and children while he watched helplessly, about the vampire who found him dying and offered him eternity as both gift and curse. He had never wanted to be king, he said, never wanted the weight of governance and political maneuvering, but responsibility had chosen him when his maker died, and left him as the eldest of their bloodline, and he had spent centuries learning to rule while forgetting how to simply live. Clara told him about being orphaned at 12 when her parents died in a car accident, about the foster system that taught her to trust only herself, about throwing herself into science because data did not abandon you, and experimental results did not leave you behind in strange houses with strange families who collected monthly checks and provided minimal affection. This child growing inside her was the first blood family she would have had in 16 years, the first connection that could not be severed by bureaucracy or indifference or death, and she would protect that connection with everything she possessed. The kiss happened without planning, a collision of desperate need and shared vulnerability, and Clara tasted centuries of loneliness on his lips, felt the bond flare bright between them like touching a live wire. His hands cradled her face with exquisite care, as though she might shatter, and she felt his anguish and his love and his terror pouring through the connection until she could not tell where her emotions ended and his began. The door opened without warning, and Isolde stood there with her face carved from ice, her voice cutting through the intimacy like a scalpel. "Sire," she said, "Counselor Lydia has arrived and requested to meet the human alone." Victor pulled back from Clara with visible effort, his expression shifting from vulnerable to guarded in the space of a heartbeat, and Clara saw real alarm flash in his eyes. "Lydia has not left her estate in 50 years, he said quietly. "Why now?" The question hung in the air without answer as Isolde waited with that preternatural patience, and Clara felt the warmth of the kiss fade into cold apprehension as she realized she was about to meet the vampire who held the deciding vote on whether her daughter would be permitted to live. The chamber where Lydia waited was deep in the spire's lower levels, a room without windows where candles provided the only light, flickering shadows across stone walls that belonged to an earlier century. Clara entered alone, because Victor had been forbidden, and she saw the ancient vampire sitting in darkness, like a spider at the center of an invisible web, a figure so old she barely looked real anymore, skin like parchment and eyes that held the weight of empires rising and falling. Lydia's voice was rust and honey, beautiful and corroded simultaneously, and she did not waste time with pleasantries before reaching out with senses Clara could not name to read her the way Clara read scientific papers, examining every possibility branching from this moment in time. "Your daughter will bridge or break the worlds," Lydia said without preamble. "In one future she unites the species in cooperation and mutual evolution. In another she ignites the war that ends both vampires and humans in mutual extinction. The pivot is not her power, child. The pivot is your choice in 11 days." Clara's frustration burned sharp and bright because prophecy without specifics was useless, was nothing more than fear-mongering dressed in mystical language, and she demanded to know what choice, what decision could possibly determine the fate of entire species. "Fate shows crossroads, not maps," Lydia said, and her ancient eyes reflected candlelight like mirrors. "But hear this clearly, because I will not repeat it. Theron is not your true enemy. He is a symptom of a sickness that runs deeper and older than his ideology. Someone wants you to fear the council. Someone wants this child born in chaos and conflict rather than peace and preparation. Trust the bond between you and Victor. Doubt those who claim to protect you. The trap is baited with safety." Clara asked the only question that mattered in that moment, asked if Lydia would vote to let her daughter live, and the ancient vampire smiled without warmth or comfort. "I will vote for the future that keeps the most threads intact," she said, "even if it cuts yours." The dismissal was clear and absolute, and Clara left the chamber on shaking legs, found Isolde waiting outside with that careful neutrality that revealed nothing. "What did she tell you?" Isolde asked, and Clara made her first strategic lie, said nothing useful, because she was beginning to understand that information was currency in this place, and she could not afford to spend it carelessly. She returned to her quarters and found an envelope on her bed, sealed with red wax that bore a crest she did not recognize, and inside were medical records, her own records from Dr. Rivera's clinic, but annotated with notes in precise handwriting. "Fetal power signature class 5 threat," the notation read. "Neutralize or weaponize. Awaiting council ruling." The stamp at the bottom bore Marina's seal, and Clara felt ice flood her veins as she realized someone had leaked classified council documents directly to her, either to panic her into making a mistake or to turn her against the very people who held her daughter's fate in their hands. She found Victor in his private study, showed him the documents with hands that wanted to shake but refused to give fear that satisfaction, and watched shock register on his face as he examined papers that should have been locked in council archives under magical wards and physical security. He called Isolde immediately, and the three of them stood in tense silence as the chief advisor explained that the palace had layers of protection, that someone with authorized access had deliberately bypassed every safeguard to plant these records where Clara would find them. Victor could not accuse Marina without proof, could not investigate council members without majority approval, could not act on suspicion alone because his power was constitutional rather than absolute, bound by laws and protocols that prevented exactly the kind of autocratic overreach that had characterized vampire leadership in earlier centuries. Then I investigate, Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. I am already the specimen they want to study. Let me be the spy as well. Victor resisted, but Clara insisted, pointed out that she had legitimate reason to request library access for researching bonding history to support her medical proposal, that no one would suspect a pregnant human of conducting counterintelligence while buried in historical texts. He finally agreed, and Isolde assigned a guard, a young vampire named Silas, who carried himself with the idealistic intensity of someone who still believed the world could be improved through effort and integrity. The palace library was vast enough to get lost in, shelf after shelf of books and scrolls and digital archives spanning centuries of vampire history, and Clara immersed herself in the research with the focused determination that had carried her through graduate school and grant applications. She found historical precedents, documented cases of bonded births before Protocol Nightshade, and the pattern that emerged made her stomach clench with recognition. The last bonded child had been named Alara Nightborn, born in 1624 to a vampire counselor and a human artist, and the records described abilities that sounded like mythology, a child who could walk in daylight and compel both species and heal injuries with touch. Alara had been 12 years old when radicals from both sides attempted simultaneous kidnappings, trying to claim her as weapon or destroy her as abomination, and in the chaos her mother had made the choice to end both their lives rather than let Alara become a tool of violence. Protocol Nightshade had been written in the aftermath, Clara realized with dawning horror, written not from cruelty but from trauma, an attempt to prevent future tragedies by eliminating the conditions that created them. Silas stood guard while she read, and eventually he spoke quietly about his own history, about a human sister who died in anti-vampire riots 10 years earlier during the chaotic treaty negotiations, about joining Victor's service because the king had fought for peace when others advocated for separation or domination. If your daughter lives, Silas said carefully, she could be proof that coexistence works, that mixed families can thrive, that evolution favors cooperation. Or she could be the spark that reignites conflict and burns down everything we have built. I do not know which possibility frightens me more. Clara found the second document tucked inside a restricted text she should not have had access to, but Silas quietly provided. A letter dated 1625, written in elegant script that had faded but remained legible. You cannot legislate love or fate, the letter read. You can only choose whether to nurture it or destroy it. You chose destruction, and I will never forgive you. The signature made Clara's breath catch in her throat. Counselor Victor Castellane. She returned to her quarters with the letter folded in her pocket and found Victor waiting there, his expression resigned and ancient, and she knew before he spoke that he was aware she had discovered his secret. Let me explain before you hate me, he said quietly, and Clara heard 800 years of grief in his voice as he told her about Isabeau, about a bond that had been joy and miracle, about a daughter he had loved with desperate intensity. He described the political shift as human kingdoms and vampire radicals both grew fearful of hybrid children, described hiring guards and moving constantly and using every magical protection he could find, all of it insufficient when Alara turned 12 and her powers manifested too visibly to hide. Both sides had attacked simultaneously, he said, his voice flat with remembered horror, and in the chaos Isabeau had grabbed their daughter and fled. And he had pursued through burning streets only to find them in a chapel, both already dead. A note in Isabeau's handwriting explaining that this was the only way to keep Alara safe from those who would use her, and from the destructive potential of her own uncontrolled power. Victor had not spoken for 10 years after that, he said. When he finally returned to governance, he had pushed protocol nightshade through council, convinced himself he was protecting future bonded families from similar tragedy, but really he was entombing his grief in law and policy, ensuring no one else would have to watch their child become a political weapon. He had fought the bond with Clara because he could not survive losing another family, had tried to stay away from her after the gala, but the bond would not permit distance, pulled them together despite his resistance and his terror. "I brought you into this knowing it might kill you," he said, his voice breaking. "Knowing it might kill our daughter. I am the monster you should fear, Clara." She was angry at the deception, furious that he had hidden something so fundamental, but beneath the anger, she understood that he was not a monster, but a father who had failed to protect his first child and could not endure failing a second time. "You do not get to decide for me," she said, her voice hard with determination. "You do not get to preemptively grieve me or our daughter. We fight together or we die together, but you do not get to carry this alone." She took his hand, and the bond flared visible between them, silver light pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeats, and through the connection she felt his anguish and his love and his terror, and she let him feel her determination and her fear and her hope. Let him understand that she was not Isabeau, was not fragile or easily broken, was a scientist who faced impossible problems with data and strategy rather than despair. "We rewrite the ending," she said firmly. "Our daughter does not die as a symbol. She lives as a person with agency and choice and a future we build for her starting now." Victor admitted that the council remained deadlocked, that Lydia's vote was unpredictable, that they needed to change the narrative from threat to control into future to nurture. And Clara proposed going public, holding a press conference with humans and vampires both, showing the ultrasound and telling their story and forcing the council to rule under public scrutiny rather than behind closed doors. Victor resisted, argued that she would paint a target on herself, but Clara pointed out that she was already the target, that hiding changed nothing, that controlling the narrative was the only power she possessed in this situation. They would hold the press conference 24 hours before the council vote, she decided, would show the world that this was not about politics, but about family, about a child who deserved the chance to live, regardless of what powers she might develop, or what symbols others tried to make her represent. Isolde entered without knocking, her vampire hearing having caught every word of their planning, and her expression was deeply concerned as she warned that this was reckless, that Theron would use such public defiance to prove Victor was unfit to rule. "Then let him try," Victor said quietly, and Clara saw him transform from grief-haunted father into the king who had survived 8 centuries of political conflict, saw him choose to fight rather than surrender to fear. They were finalizing logistics when Clara felt sharp pain lance through her abdomen, a sensation that made her gasp and double over. And when she looked down, her shirt was glowing faintly from within, silver light pulsing through fabric as the baby manifested power weeks earlier than any projection had predicted. Victor called for medics with barely controlled panic in his voice, and Clara felt the pregnancy accelerating beyond their calculations, felt her daughter fighting to exist with a ferocity that both terrified and awed her, and she realized with sudden clarity that they might not have 24 hours, might not have time for press conferences or strategic planning, might be forced into crisis management with no preparation and no allies except each other, and a bond that was still learning how to function under impossible pressure. The palace physicians worked with controlled urgency as Clara lay on the examination table, their instruments humming and their faces grave as they measured the impossible development occurring inside her body. The fetus was growing at triple the rate of normal vampire gestation, Dr. Helena Cross explained in a voice that carried 4 centuries of medical experience and barely concealed dread. And if the acceleration continued, Clara would deliver in 5 to 7 days, rather than the projected 6 weeks that had already seemed dangerously compressed. Clara felt her body straining under the biological impossibility, felt her human frame protesting the demands being placed upon it by a child who was rewriting the rules of reproduction with every hour that passed. They started IV nutrients immediately, magical stabilizers that felt like cold fire in her veins, and Helena took charge with the efficiency of someone who had seen too many supernatural medical crises and learned to compartmentalize terror into clinical action. Victor stood against the wall watching with an expression that aged him visibly, and Clara saw him transformed from eternal being into mortal man, confronting the finite fragility of everything he loved. Helena pulled Victor aside for what she thought was a private consultation, but Clara's adrenaline-sharpened hearing caught every word as the physician confessed that she had delivered Alara centuries ago, that she had failed to save Isabeau when her body gave out in the final week of pregnancy, that Clara's condition was already worse than Isabeau's had been at the same stage. The child needed to be delivered by cesarean section, Helena said quietly. But the surgical intervention would cause Mira's power signature to spike dramatically, and every supernatural creature in the city would feel the surge of energy, like a beacon announcing the birth to allies and enemies alike. The impossible choice crystallized with brutal clarity: wait and risk Clara's deteriorating health, or operate and broadcast the birth to everyone, including those who wanted Mira dead before she drew her first breath. Clara made the decision herself before Victor could speak, her voice cutting through their whispered consultation with the flat certainty of someone who had run all the calculations and accepted the only viable outcome. "We operate tomorrow," she said, "and we broadcast it." Victor turned to her with horror written across his face and argued that she would be at her most vulnerable during surgery, that they would be inviting attack at the moment when she could least defend herself. "So we surround the operating room with guards," Clara countered, "and cameras. They want a spectacle, so we give them one, but we control the narrative. We show them a birth, not a threat. We make them see a family instead of a political problem." The plan took shape through the early hours of morning as they worked out logistics and security protocols, deciding to schedule the surgery for the following evening just hours before the council vote. To live stream the cesarean section with Clara's full consent and appropriate medical privacy protections, while Victor narrated for the global audience. He would explain the bond, describe the child growing inside Clara, articulate the risk and the love and the hope that had brought them to this impossible moment, and he would force viewers to feel empathy before politics could calcify their positions into tribal allegiances. Theron learned of their plan through channels that suggested a spy within the palace itself, someone with access to their private discussions who fed intelligence to the council faction most determined to enforce Protocol Nightshade. He called an emergency council session and demanded an immediate vote before the broadcast could occur, before public sentiment could be manipulated by emotional appeals and carefully staged medical theater. Victor refused on procedural grounds, pointing out that they lacked the required quorum without Lydia's presence. But Theron smiled with cold satisfaction as he revealed that the ancient oracle had already submitted her vote by proxy. She had sent a written declaration supporting termination as necessary for timeline stability, and Victor felt the betrayal like a physical blow as he realized the vampire he had cautiously trusted had condemned his daughter to death from the safety of her distant estate. With Lydia's vote, the tally stood at 4-3 against the pregnancy, and Protocol Nightshade activated automatically under vampire law with all its terrible machinery of enforcement. Clara had until dawn to comply with mandatory termination or accept immediate exile with a kill order that would execute automatically if she ever returned to treaty territories. Victor had no legal recourse, no constitutional authority to override a properly conducted council vote, and the press conference that was meant to build public support had transformed overnight into an act of open rebellion against the very governmental structures he had spent centuries building and maintaining. The midnight hours found Clara refusing termination with a stubbornness that was equal parts courage and desperation, choosing exile and surgery simultaneously, because if she was leaving, then she was leaving with her daughter alive in her arms, rather than dead in a medical waste container. Victor made his own choice in that dark hour before dawn, standing before Isolde and Ellis, and the handful of loyalists who had gathered in his private chambers, and declaring his immediate abdication from the throne. If vampire law forced him to choose between crown and family, then he chose family without hesitation or regret, chose love over power and his daughter's life over political stability. Isolde tried to stop him with arguments about succession crisis and power vacuums, warned that Theron would seize control and undo centuries of careful diplomatic progress. But Victor's voice was steel-wrapped in velvet as he said the council would learn what it meant to rule without his steady hand at the helm. He was done sacrificing love for law, done prioritizing order over the beating hearts of those he cherished, done being king when being father was the only role that mattered in this moment. Counselor Ellis arrived in person, rather than sending a proxy, his face grave but determined as he told Victor he was a fool, and also completely right, that Ellis was prepared to stand with him regardless of political consequences. They converted the surgical theater into a broadcast studio, with cameras and lights and medical equipment arranged to capture everything while protecting Clara's dignity, and she lay awake on the operating table with only an epidural for pain management because she refused full sedation, refused to miss the moment when her daughter entered the world. Victor began the live stream by speaking directly to the camera, addressing both humans and vampires with the story of how an accidental bond at a diplomatic gala had grown into love, how an impossible pregnancy had challenged everything they thought they knew about supernatural biology, how the council's ruling had forced him to choose between duty and devotion. He made his appeal to the millions watching, asked them to witness not a political crisis, but a birth, to see not a threat, but a tiny person who deserved the chance to live before the world decided what her existence might mean for the future of two species learning to coexist. Clara spoke between contractions, her voice breathless but firm as she identified herself as a scientist who dealt in evidence and empirical observation, and the only evidence she needed was the heartbeat she had been listening to for weeks. She did not care if her daughter was a threat to the established order, because Mira was a promise to her, a promise of family and connection and love that could not be legislated away or voted into non-existence by politicians terrified of change. Dr. Helena operated with steady hands while Victor held Clara's palm, and the cameras captured everything through careful framing that showed the moment without voyeuristic intrusion. At 3:47 in the morning, Mira Castellane entered the world with a cry that seemed impossibly loud for such a small body, and Clara saw her daughter for the first time and wept at the perfection of tiny fingers and the silver-gray eyes that were already open and aware. Mira's pupils flashed gold when the surgical lights caught them, an indication of power beyond anything the physicians had predicted, and the moment of her birth sent a surge of energy through the city that made lights flicker and magical wards hum with resonance. Victor held his daughter with hands that trembled and tears streaming down his face as he whispered a greeting to the child he had been waiting centuries to meet again. And 40 million viewers around the world watched a vampire king transformed into a father, cradling his newborn daughter with infinite tenderness. Theron crashed the broadcast with a remote video feed, his face rigid with fury as he declared the birth illegal and demanded that the child be surrendered to council custody immediately for evaluation and potential containment. Victor looked directly into the camera with his daughter secure in his arms and issued a two-word challenge: "Come take her." Alarms began blaring before the words had finished echoing through the broadcast, and Isolde was shouting warnings about multiple breach points as armed forces converged on the spire from two directions simultaneously. Council enforcers led by Theron's Lieutenant Cassius approached from the vampire quarter, while human militants from an organization calling itself the Purity Front attacked from street level with explosives and military-grade weapons. Both sides wanted Mira for different reasons. wanted to either contain her as a supernatural threat or eliminate her as proof that human-vampire cooperation could produce viable offspring. And Victor realized with sickening clarity that his broadcast had not created safety through transparency, but had instead painted an enormous target on his family. The siege developed with terrifying speed as Cassius led vampire enforcers through the lower levels, while Rachel Quinn commanded human militants who believed all supernatural human genetic mixing must be purged before it contaminated humanity beyond redemption. Clara was moved to a secure room while still weak from surgery. Mira cradled against her chest as Victor coordinated defensive positions, and Isolde took command of the palace guard with Ellis reinforcing magical wards. Silas positioned himself outside Clara's door with the grim determination of someone who had already decided he would die before letting enemies pass. And the battle became a floor-by-floor grind as vampire fought vampire in hallways that had been designed for diplomacy rather than combat. The human militants breached lower levels with shaped charges and automatic weapons, bringing chaos and fire to a building that had stood for 3 centuries as a symbol of supernatural power and political stability. The cameras were still rolling because no one had thought to shut down the broadcast, and the world watched in real time as the spire transformed into a war zone with a newborn child at the center of the conflict. Public opinion fractured along predictable lines, with some demanding immediate intervention to protect Clara and Mira, while others called for the child's elimination as necessary for public safety, and social media became a battlefield of competing narratives about whether Mira represented evolution or extinction. An explosion rocked the building, and Mira began to cry. And suddenly, a protective shield of pure light erupted from her tiny body to cover Clara in a dome of energy that was instinctive and untrained and far more powerful than any 3-hour-old child should be capable of manifesting. The cameras caught everything, and Rachel Quinn hijacked the stream to deliver her own message, pointing at the footage of Mira's shield as proof that the child was a weapon that would enslave humanity if allowed to mature. Theron countered with his own broadcast, declaring that the child represented chaos and disorder, that only council authority could protect civilization from the destabilizing influence of unregulated supernatural human hybridization, that surrender would end the bloodshed and save countless lives. Victor could have ended it in that moment, could have surrendered Mira to stop the battle and prevent further casualties. But surrender meant losing his daughter to people who had already voted to terminate her existence. Clara made the choice for both of them by staggering to the balcony with Mira in her arms, still bleeding from surgery but determined to speak directly to the millions watching worldwide. She went live with her own message, her voice raw and desperate as she accused the world of being so terrified of what Mira might become that they were willing to kill who she was right now, a 3-hour-old baby who had done nothing except be born. Judge her actions when she has actions to judge, Clara said. Give her a chance to live before you decide she is a monster. The speech shifted momentum in ways that military force could not. And protesters outside the spire who had been watching on their phones began to turn against both the council enforcers and the Purity Front, chanting demands to let the baby live and forming human shields around the building's perimeter. Cassius fought his way to Clara's floor and engaged Silas in brutal hand-to-hand combat that the younger vampire lost, but not before buying enough time for Victor to arrive. Victor confronted Cassius in a hallway still smoking from explosions and told him to choose between following Theron's orders and following his own conscience, and Cassius hesitated because he had seen the broadcast, had watched Mira's innocent face and Clara's desperate courage and Victor's absolute devotion. He had his orders, but Victor had his daughter, and Victor told Cassius that the only way to reach Mira was through her father's corpse. Lydia appeared between them before violence could resolve the standoff, physically present in the spire for the first time in decades, and her single word stopped both vampires in their tracks. "Enough," she said, and then she looked at Clara with eyes that held millennia of accumulated wisdom and manipulation. I lied in my vote, Lydia continued. Deliberately lied to force this exact crisis because the timeline required chaos to reveal truth. Now comes the real choice. She extended her hand toward Clara. Give me the child. Clara refused, with every protective instinct screaming against surrendering Mira to the vampire who had voted to kill her. But Lydia revealed that she had manufactured the crisis specifically to test everyone involved, to see if Victor would choose love over power, and if Clara would risk death to give birth, and if the world would rally to protect an innocent or demand her destruction. Victor had proven worthy through abdication and Clara through courage, and perhaps even the world was worthy given the millions now protesting for Mira's life, but the child herself remained unknown. Lydia needed to read Mira's fate directly, needed to see whether she was the destroyer feared or the bridge hoped for, and she promised that if Mira represented existential threat, then Lydia would end the child's life herself, regardless of consequences. Clara faced the impossible choice of trusting the woman who had betrayed her, or condemning Mira to a life of constant running and hiding, and Victor counseled quietly that Lydia had never lied about what she saw, only about when she chose to reveal her visions. Clara's hands trembled as she allowed Lydia to touch Mira's forehead, and the ancient vampire gasped as her eyes went white with prophetic sight. A full minute of silence stretched while Lydia stood frozen, seeing futures branch and collapse and branch again in patterns too complex for linear minds to comprehend. She finally spoke with wonder in her voice, describing a child who was extraordinary, but not in the ways they had feared, a being who would live unremarkably in most timelines as a bridge builder and healer and teacher. In a few futures, Mira became the destroyer they had dreaded, but only in timelines where she was caged and broken and taught to see herself as a monster rather than a person. The pivot was not her nature but their nurture, not her inherent power, but how the world chose to respond to her existence. Lydia declared her vote changed in favor of Mira's life and proposed new law that would recognize bonded children as sacred and protected, raised in transparency rather than hidden in shame, guided rather than feared. With Lydia's reversal, the vote stood at 4-3 in favor. Protocol Nightshade was overturned, and Mira received legal recognition as a person rather than a problem to be solved. Theron appeared in person with rage distorting his features and accused Lydia of destroying the order they had built, but Lydia countered that she had saved it because order without evolution was just another word for extinction. Theron invoked his final option under ancient vampire law, challenging the bond itself through the rite of dissolution, a magical trial that would force Viktor and Clara to prove their bond was genuine by surviving manifestations of their deepest fears. If the bond shattered under testing, then Mira's legal protections would dissolve with it, leaving her vulnerable to termination regardless of the council vote. Victor accepted the challenge without hesitation, and Theron named the time as now, before the council and the cameras, letting the world watch as the bonded pair faced trial by ordeal. Clara was still recovering from surgery and barely able to stand, but she took Victor's hand with fingers that locked around his palm like iron. Together, she said, just one word that contained everything they had built and everything they stood to lose. Lydia began the ritual, and the chamber filled with dark mist that swallowed light and sound, and her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere as she explained that they must face themselves and face each other and survive to prove their bond unbreakable. The mist consumed them completely, and the broadcast continued, but all viewers could see was darkness, and all they could hear was Clara and Victor screaming as the trial began. The trial's mechanics operated on principles that violated conventional physics and psychology simultaneously, trapping each bonded person inside their private hell, made tangible, and forcing them to reach each other through manifestations of their deepest terrors, while knowing that any attempt to abandon the bond and escape alone would shatter the connection permanently. Victor found himself standing in the chapel again, the same chapel from 1624, where his world had ended the first time. And Isabeau and Alara lay on the floor in spreading pools of blood that looked black in the dim light filtering through stained glass windows. But this time the bodies wore Clara's face and Mira's impossibly small form, and Victor's mind fractured with the realization that he was watching his failure repeat across centuries, watching himself arrive too late to save the people he loved. The scene reset every time he tried to reach them, looping back to the moment of his arrival, but placing him 1 second further from salvation with each iteration, 1 second that stretched into an eternity of helplessness and grief. Isabeau's ghost materialized beside him with eyes that held accusation rather than the love he remembered. And her voice was cold as she told him he had failed them and would fail Clara and Mira because he was cursed. Because everyone he loved died while he remained eternal and untouched by the mortality that claimed those who made the mistake of binding themselves to him. A door appeared in the chapel wall, simple wood with brass fittings, and a voice that might have been his own whispered that he could exit, could save himself, could let Clara go because if he did not love her, then he could not lose her the way he had lost Isabeau. The temptation pulled at him with the weight of 8 centuries of accumulated grief, offered him the safety of emotional isolation and the terrible comfort of never risking this kind of loss again. But even trapped in nightmare, he could feel Clara through the bond, alive and fighting her own trial somewhere in the darkness, terrified but unbroken, and the connection between them pulsed like a silver thread that anchored him to something beyond his own trauma. Victor stopped trying to reach the phantoms, and instead spoke to them directly, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face as he acknowledged that he had failed Isabeau and Alara, had been unable to protect them from a world that feared what they represented. But he had learned from losing them, had spent centuries analyzing his mistakes and understanding where his protection had become suffocation, where his love had isolated them, rather than empowering them to defend themselves. He would fight harder now, and smarter now, and most importantly, he would not face the threats alone, because Clara was his partner rather than his responsibility, his equal rather than someone who needed his protection. Isabeau's ghost smiled for the first time since appearing, and her expression transformed from accusation to benediction as she told him to forgive himself, told him he deserved this happiness, told him to let her go so he could fully embrace the family waiting for him in the present rather than the past. The phantom dissolved into light and the loop broke, and Victor saw a brightness ahead that felt like Clara's presence, felt like home, and he ran toward it with everything he possessed. Clara's nightmare placed her in a hospital with fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell that always reminded her of loss and isolation. And Mira lay in a bed surrounded by shadowy doctors who told Clara this was her fault, that she had insisted on bringing the child into the world, and now Mira suffered because of her mother's selfish desire for family. She watched her daughter age rapidly through stages of pain and deterioration, saw Mira at 1 year old screaming with powers that burned through her small body, saw her at 5 years weak and exhausted from fighting against her own nature, saw her at 10 years begging Clara to let her go, to end the suffering that seemed built into her hybrid existence. A doctor offered a syringe filled with something clear and final, told Clara she had the power to stop this, that she had possessed the power to prevent it entirely by choosing termination when the council had demanded it. Every fear Clara had suppressed since learning of her pregnancy surfaced in a flood of guilt and second-guessing. All the night she had laid awake wondering if her desire for a child was condemning Mira to a life defined by suffering and persecution and loneliness. The phantom Mira aged to 16 and lay frail in the hospital bed, her voice breaking as she asked why Clara had made her live like this, why she had forced her into existence as a monster that everyone hated, including herself. Clara's hand closed around the syringe, and part of her mind whispered that this was the hard choice, the responsible choice, the choice that would prove she loved Mira enough to prioritize her daughter's well-being over her own need for family. But through the nightmare she felt Victor fighting and refusing to quit, felt his determination flowing through the bond like steel reinforcing her crumbling resolve. The realization hit her with the force of scientific revelation. This was not prophecy but fear, not prediction, but anxiety projected into the future and given form by magical trial. She did not control whether Mira would suffer, could not prevent every pain or shield her daughter from every cruelty the world might inflict, could only control the love she gave in the present and the tools she provided for Mira to build her own life. Clara dropped the syringe, and it shattered on the hospital floor as she gathered the phantom Mira into her arms and spoke with absolute conviction. She admitted she did not know if Mira would suffer, did not know if the world would hurt her, could not promise protection from every threat or guarantee happiness across a lifetime whose parameters remained unknown. But Clara knew she would be present for whatever came, would fight for her daughter and teach her daughter to fight for herself, would refuse to see Mira as a burden or a mistake or anything other than a person with agency and choice. Mira was not Clara's burden, but her daughter, and she would decide for herself what kind of life she wanted to live. The phantom transformed, and suddenly Clara held the real Mira, her actual daughter, somehow magically present within the trial, glowing with power and safe and impossibly speaking a single word, Mom. The baby told her that she chose life because Clara had chosen it first, and Clara felt something break open in her chest as she understood that her daughter was already fighting for existence, was already claiming her right to be. She saw Victor's light approaching through the dissolving nightmare, and she reached for it with hands that would not let go. They met in a space between nightmares, where nothing existed except them and the bond, and one final test that manifested as a figure calling itself the Architect, a magical construct born from the bonding magic itself, and designed to determine if they truly deserved the connection they claimed. The Architect asked why they merited this bond, when countless others had attempted and failed. What made them different from all the pairs who had shattered under pressure or crumbled under scrutiny? Victor answered first with brutal honesty, admitting he did not deserve the bond, acknowledging he was broken and haunted by failures that spanned centuries. But he chose Clara, and chose the bond, and would continue choosing both every day, for as long as he existed. And choice mattered more than worthiness. Clara added that she did not know if they were different from failed pairs, could not claim special status or unique compatibility, but they were honest about the costs and willing to pay them together, rather than expecting one partner to shoulder burdens alone. The Architect issued its challenge with the cold logic of magical contract, explaining that bonds required fuel and one partner must sacrifice life force or memory or power for the connection to solidify permanently. Victor responded immediately by offering himself and everything he possessed, but Clara refused with the same stubbornness that had brought her through nightmare. They would both pay equally, or the bond was not real, she declared, because bonds had always been unequal, with one partner giving more. And that imbalance was why they failed. She and Victor were rewriting the rules to demand equality, 50-50 contribution, and shared burden and shared strength. Victor agreed without hesitation, affirming that they were partners rather than savior, and saved, equals rather than protector and protected. The Architect fell silent, and then laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane, and admitted that no one had ever negotiated with it before, that the terms were acceptable, that the bond would accept the new framework they proposed. The price manifested as mutual loss. Victor surrendered a century of memories that were non-critical but still meaningful, gaps in his timeline that would never be recovered, while Clara lost her ability to feel physical pain and gained instead an empathic connection that meant she would feel Victor's injuries as though they were her own. The bond became visible as a silver cord pulsing between their hearts, sharing life and strength in equal measure, and they emerged from the trial together holding hands. They woke on the council chamber floor with Theron standing over them, his face twisted with fury, as he declared their survival impossible because no one had ever emerged from the rite of dissolution with bond intact. Lydia corrected him calmly, explaining that Viktor and Clara had not merely survived, but evolved the bond into something new, something unbreakable under vampire law and precedent. The broadcast had continued throughout the trial, and 60 million viewers had watched them scream and collapse and rise again, had seen them fight for each other through manifestations of terror that would have shattered weaker connections. Social media exploded with support, and the hashtag #LetLoveWin trended globally as humans and vampires both responded to the raw display of commitment they had witnessed. Theron played his final card with the precision of someone who had been planning this move since the moment Viktor abdicated, pointing out that while the bond was now legal and the child protected by council ruling, Viktor himself had renounced his authority and therefore possessed no power to defend his family against future threats. The council had elected Theron as interim king by majority vote, and his first official act was to exile the Castellane family from all vampire territories, making them legal but banished, protected by law but stripped of community and resources. The shock rippled through the chamber as Viktor processed the reality that he had been removed from power by the very governmental structures he had built, and his allies faced impossible choices between duty to the people they served and loyalty to the king who had sacrificed everything for love. Ellis and most of the palace guard chose to stay because they believed their positions allowed them to moderate Theron's influence, but Isolde and Silas left with Viktor because some bonds transcended political calculation. Clara's fury burned white-hot as she confronted the council members who had voted for Theron's regime, demanded to know how they could exile the person who had saved them and fought for peace and built the frameworks that allowed vampires and humans to coexist. Marina answered with the flat certainty of someone who believed in institutional stability above individual gratitude, explaining that Viktor had broken their laws and consequences existed even for love, even for sacrifice, even for choices made with noble intentions. They had 24 hours to leave vampire territories and could take nothing that belonged to the crown, which meant everything Viktor had accumulated across 8 centuries of rule. The human response surprised them because the global broadcast had shifted public opinion dramatically, and Sophia Devereaux offered asylum on behalf of human governments that had watched Viktor and Clara prove their commitment to cooperation and mutual understanding. The human territories would shelter them and protect them and support them because they had demonstrated through action rather than words that they belonged to both species rather than one. They relocated to Montreal, the neutral city where the original treaty establishing human-vampire relations had been signed, and they moved into a small apartment that was nothing like the palace Viktor had called home for centuries. Adjustment proved harder for Viktor than for Clara, because he had not lived as a commoner in 800 years, had forgotten what it meant to navigate daily life without resources and staff, and the automatic deference that came with royalty. Clara adapted easily because poverty and instability had defined her childhood, and she found dark humor in the role reversal that placed her as teacher, while Viktor learned to cook and clean and manage a household budget. Mira grew with the unsettling speed of hybrid biology, appearing 6 months old at 2 weeks of actual life, and she hit developmental milestones that filled their small apartment with wonder. Her first smile came for Clara during a midnight feeding. Her first laugh erupted when Viktor attempted to cook breakfast and created something that barely qualified as edible. And though she did not speak yet, her eyes tracked everything with intelligence that suggested awareness far beyond her apparent age. The bond evolved as Clara and Viktor learned to navigate shared empathy, feeling each other's emotions with an intensity that required new communication strategies and boundaries. Clara felt Viktor's grief at losing the throne and the people he had served, felt his identity crisis as he grappled with who he was without the crown that had defined him for centuries. Viktor felt Clara's exhaustion from new motherhood, combined with post-surgery recovery, felt her determination to prove this sacrifice had meaning, felt her love for him and for Mira sustaining her through difficulties that would have broken someone with less stubbornness. They balanced each other through the adjustment, offering strength when the other wavered, providing perspective when grief or fear threatened to overwhelm. Isolde embraced her role as Mira's godmother with fierce protectiveness, and Silas ran interference with media outlets that hounded them constantly for interviews and statements and photographs. Viktor fell into depression 3 weeks after exile, asking Clara late one night if he had made the right choice, if he had abandoned his people for selfish reasons disguised as love. Clara gave him honesty rather than comfort, admitting she did not know if the choice was right, but pointing out that he had made it, and now they needed to make it worth the cost, needed to build a life that proved love was strength rather than weakness. News filtered in from vampire territories describing Theron's regime reversing Viktor's progressive policies, cracking down on human-vampire relationships, arresting protesters who demanded a return to the previous administration's approach. The peace they had fought for was fracturing, and public pressure mounted as humans and moderate vampires begged Viktor to reclaim the throne, calling him the rightful king and demanding he return to prevent Theron from destroying everything they had built. Viktor refused every entreaty because he had abdicated legally and would not start a civil war, would not plunge both species into conflict because he regretted consequences he had accepted. 3 months passed, and Mira appeared 2 years old, speaking in complete sentences and demonstrating telekinetic abilities that required constant supervision to prevent accidents. She moved objects with her mind when excited or frustrated, and Clara documented everything with scientific precision while Viktor marveled at his daughter's impossible existence. Counselor Ellis arrived at their apartment bloody and desperate, having fled vampire territories under threat of execution, and his message shattered their fragile domestic peace. Theron was planning a purge of any vampire with human ties or sympathies, Ellis explained, scheduled to begin in 72 hours, with mass arrests and executions designed to eliminate opposition and consolidate power. Viktor was the only person with enough authority and support to stop the purge, Ellis said, and he begged Viktor to return, to reclaim leadership, to save the people who would die if Theron's plan proceeded unchallenged. Ellis's plea carried the weight of manufactured crisis, as he explained that Theron had fabricated evidence of a human conspiracy to infiltrate vampire leadership and was using the false narrative to justify mass arrests targeting any vampire with human partners or friends or sympathies. The list contained 300 names including Helena the doctor who had delivered Mira, several of Viktor's former palace guards who had remained loyal through his abdication, and moderate council supporters who had advocated for progressive policies during Viktor's reign. Executions were scheduled to begin in 72 hours and would be public broadcasts designed to terrify both populations into compliance and submission through spectacle of violence. Viktor's dilemma crystallized into impossible mathematics. If he returned to challenge Theron, it would trigger civil war. That could kill thousands, but if he remained in exile, 300 innocent vampires would die for the crime of choosing connection over isolation. Clara reframed the question with characteristic precision, pointing out that Viktor was asking whether to fight when he should be asking how to fight, reminding him that his strength lay in diplomacy rather than warfare. Viktor proposed invoking the conclave of testimony, an ancient rite where vampire leadership was decided not through combat but through truth, with each candidate presenting their vision to the people who would vote to determine their ruler. The approach carried enormous risk because it required Theron's agreement, and Theron could simply refuse the challenge, but Ellis revealed leverage in the form of Theron's secret. The human conspiracy evidence was entirely fabricated, and Ellis possessed proof in the form of documents and digital trails that would expose Theron as a fraud if Viktor threatened to make the information public. Clara expressed immediate concern about the danger to their family, pointing out that returning to vampire territory would make Victor a target and by extension would endanger her and Mira. But Victor countered that Mira was already a target and hiding would not protect her while building a just world might. Mira spoke up with the impossible articulation of a toddler whose development outpaced normal parameters, telling Victor to go help people while promising that she and Clara would stay safe and he would come back to them. Victor accepted the mission and agreed to return to the spire to challenge Theron through testimony rather than bloodshed, while Clara and Mira remained in Montreal under the protection of Isolde and Silas. The goodbye carried the weight of separation amplified through their bond as Victor held Mira and promised to bring her back a better world, then kissed Clara with the ache of distance already pulling at the connection between them. Victor departed with Ellis while Clara watched from the apartment window with Mira standing beside her, and the child observed quietly that her father was scared, prompting Clara to kneel and explain that brave people were often scared, but refused to let fear stop them from doing what needed to be done. Victor's return to the spire was met by Theron surrounded by guards, and Victor formally invoked the conclave while presenting Ellis's evidence of fabrication in a public broadcast that accused Theron of lying to their people and challenged him to prove his fitness for leadership through direct testimony. Theron accepted the challenge, but added conditions that prohibited Victor from having allies or guards during the proceedings, restricting him to words alone, and Victor agreed because words were the only weapons he needed. The conclave convened in the Grand Hall, with thousands of vampires in attendance for the first time in decades, while humans watched via broadcast, and each leader was granted 1 hour to present their vision before the population voted. Theron testified first and spoke of order and tradition and purity, showing footage of human violence against vampires while arguing that Victor's progressive policies had emboldened human extremists and led to riots and death that proved separation was the only path to peace. Theron displayed Clara and Mira on screen and referred to them as the human who had seduced their king and the hybrid abomination she had birthed, and the crowd murmured with fear and disgust rippling through the assembled vampires. Theron concluded by framing the choice as a decision between Victor, who had chosen his human over his people, and Theron, who chose the vampires, urging them to vote for strength and survival and purity. Approximately 40% of the crowd applauded, while the rest remained silent and uncertain. And then Victor took the stage and began not with policy, but with personal history. He told them about being human 800 years ago and dying of plague when a vampire saved him, not because he was special, but because she believed every life mattered. And he admitted that he had forgotten that principle for centuries while ruling with law and order and distance that made him effective, but left him empty. Victor discussed Clara not as scandal, but as teacher, explaining that she had reminded him why civilizations exist, not to control people, but to protect their ability to love and grow and choose their own paths. He showed footage of Mira's birth and her shield protecting Clara and her laughter, describing how his 2-month-old daughter could move objects with her mind and speak 3 languages and possessed enormous power that she used to help her mother reach high shelves and stack blocks. Victor challenged the audience to consider what it meant if they could not allow a child to simply be a child, pointing out that Theron offered safety through fear while he offered risk through hope. He acknowledged that humans could hurt vampires just as vampires could hurt humans, but insisted they could also build together. And the fundamental question was whether they wanted to be people who cowered behind walls or people who built bridges between communities. Victor played recordings of Theron's own voice ordering the fabrication of evidence and planning the purge for power consolidation rather than safety, and the crowd erupted as Theron's betrayal was revealed in his own words. Theron raged that the footage was lies and doctored recordings, but Victor challenged him to submit to Lydia's truth reading immediately to prove his innocence, and Theron's refusal confirmed his guilt to everyone watching. The vote was overwhelming with 85% supporting Victor's return to the throne, and Theron was deposed and arrested, but as guards moved to take him into custody, Theron smiled and observed that Viktor had won at the conclave, but his human and his abomination remained unguarded, and Theron's allies did not require a throne to act on their shared ideology. In Montreal, at that exact moment, Clara was putting Mira to bed and singing a lullaby when the power cut out and plunged the apartment into darkness, and Isolde's enhanced senses detected multiple vampires surrounding the building who were not council enforcers, but mercenaries hired by Theron before his political fall. Silas activated magical wards that Clara had helped design during her months of studying supernatural defenses, and the wards bought them minutes rather than hours before mercenaries breached the apartment with orders to kidnap Mira and kill Clara and send Viktor a devastating message. Clara fought despite being unarmed and untrained in combat, using intelligence and desperation to deploy household items as weapons, including pepper spray and boiling water, and a lamp wielded as a bludgeon. Isolde engaged 3 mercenaries simultaneously in the hallway in combat too fast for human eyes to track, and she managed to eliminate 2 attackers before the third stabbed her with a silver blade that was lethal to vampires. Bleeding from the fatal wound, Isolde locked herself and the remaining mercenary in a room to buy Clara time to escape with Mira, sacrificing herself to protect the family she had sworn to guard. Clara grabbed Mira and fled to the roof, where Silas met her wounded but alive after holding off additional attackers below, but they found themselves cornered at the roof's edge with mercenaries closing in and no way down. Mira sensed the danger and erupted with telekinetic power that threw mercenaries backward, but she could not control the wild energy at her young age, and it lashed out indiscriminately, cracking concrete and shattering windows as she burned through her reserves too quickly. Clara felt Viktor through the bond, despite the distance, and closed her eyes to channel his presence, whispering to Mira that her father was coming and she needed to hold on just a little longer. Mira focused her scattered power and condensed the wild energy into a stable shield surrounding only herself and Clara, creating a barrier the mercenaries could not penetrate, even though it also prevented escape. Viktor felt the bond spike with Clara's terror and Mira's power surge, and he abandoned the spire immediately to fly across borders at vampire speed, arriving on the Montreal roof in a blur of motion. He dismantled the mercenaries in seconds with the efficiency of an ancient predator protecting his family, showing no mercy to those who had threatened what he loved most. The shield dropped as Viktor reached Clara and Mira leaped into his arms while Clara collapsed against him, shaking with adrenaline and fear. They found Isolde dying from her silver wound in the apartment, and she used her final moments to make Viktor promise he would protect Clara and Mira always before she died in his arms. Viktor's victory at the conclave felt hollow in the face of Isolde's death and his family's trauma, and he understood that this would not be the last attack, because Theron's network of extremists extended far beyond one imprisoned leader. Mira spoke quietly into the grief-heavy silence and observed that bad people would keep coming and they needed to stop them forever. And Clara and Viktor exchanged a look of recognition that their 2-month-old daughter had just proposed war. Viktor returned to the spire with Clara and Mira and tripled security, while Theron remained imprisoned, but his conspirators scattered into hiding or fled to territories beyond Viktor's immediate jurisdiction. The public response to the attack on Clara and Mira shifted global opinion dramatically, because even vampire skeptics were horrified by the targeting of a mother and infant child, and the violence crossed cultural lines that made it universally condemned. Viktor addressed the vampire nation and spoke of Isolde's sacrifice and the 300 vampires who had been targeted for loving across species, declaring that they would no longer legislate love or punish connection, and promising that any vampire who harmed a bonded pair or their children would face him personally. The Isolde Accords established legal protections for mixed families and provided resources for bonded pregnancies, and created education programs designed to reduce fear through information and exposure. Clara became the official ambassador between human and vampire medical communities and used her research to document Mira's development and prove that hybrids were not threats but simply children developing along different timelines. Mira, at 6 months old, appeared 5 years old and demonstrated extraordinary abilities, including empathy and intelligence and power. But she also showed kindness and played equally with human and vampire children, becoming a living symbol of possibility and cooperation. Resistance to the new order persisted among extremists on both sides, but these factions became marginalized rather than mainstream, as the majority of both populations embraced the changes. Viktor and Clara developed a co-ruling partnership where he handled vampire politics while she managed human relations, and their bond made them uniquely effective because they could feel each other's insights and balance each other's blind spots in real time. Lydia met with Clara privately and revisited her earlier prophecy, explaining that she had voted not just for Mira's life, but for the world Mira could help create. And most timelines showed that world lasting, though some showed it failing at a pivot point that always centered on whether Mira learned to wield power with compassion or with fear. Clara made a vow that they would teach Mira compassion and model it in their own governance and relationships. Evening found the family in their private quarters when Mira asked why people hated her, and Clara answered with honesty that some people feared what they did not understand, but Mira did not exist. To make others comfortable and should focus on being herself because they loved her exactly as she was. Victor added that Mira was not a symbol, but a person, and should never forget her own humanity, despite how others might try to reduce her to representation. Mira responded with wisdom beyond her apparent years, acknowledging that she understood she was a person, but pointing out that symbols could be people too. Like her mother and father were both individuals and representations of possibility, and she would try to be a good symbol by being a person who helped others. They stood together on the balcony overlooking the city below where humans and vampires coexisted imperfectly but genuinely, and the bond glowed faintly between Victor and Clara, while Mira stood between them holding both their hands. Victor whispered to Clara that they had rewritten the ending, but Clara smiled and corrected him, observing that they had not rewritten an ending, but had instead written a beginning for something entirely new. Time had reshaped the world in 5 years, and Mira at age 5 appeared 12 years old as she attended the Hybrid Academy, a special school created for children of mixed heritage where supernatural and human bloodlines merged in students who represented the future Victor and Clara had fought to build. The Isolde Accords had transformed society in ways both profound and practical, establishing legal protections for bonded pairs and creating systems that celebrated rather than feared mixed children. Though prejudice still lingered in corners resistant to change and progress remained uneven across different regions and communities. Victor ruled as a beloved king whose fairness and progressive vision and strength had earned trust from humans and respect from vampires, successfully bridging divides that had seemed unbridgeable when he first met Clara in that interrogation room years ago. Clara had published groundbreaking research on hybrid biology that saved countless lives and earned her offers from prestigious universities, but she remained at the spire where her family needed her presence, and her expertise continued shaping policy and medical practice. Mira struggled with challenges unique to her existence as she wielded powers including telekinesis and empathy and limited precognition, but the abilities that made her extraordinary also made her lonely because other hybrid children were rare, and she felt fundamentally different from everyone around her. A human classmate mocked her one afternoon, calling her freak and monster, and Mira's power flared in response as she nearly hurt him before stopping herself with horror at what she had almost done. Victor and Clara sat with her afterward and explained that power without control became destruction, acknowledging that her anger was valid, but emphasizing that her choice of restraint demonstrated true strength rather than weakness. Mira asked if she would always be scary to people, and Clara answered with gentle honesty that some people would always fear her, but the people who mattered would see her rather than just her power. A new student named Asher arrived at the academy, half werewolf and half human at age 13, and he was awkward and kind, and completely unconcerned that Mira was different, and they became best friends who made each other laugh and feel normal. Asher made Mira experience her first innocent crush, the kind of age-appropriate romance that made her blush and smile and forget for moments that she carried the weight of being a symbol. Victor expressed protective concern about the friendship developing into something more. But Clara cut off his worries and reminded him that Mira was growing up and they needed to let her experience normal developmental milestones. An anonymous threat arrived bearing Theron's symbol with a message declaring that the abomination and her parents had lived too long, and the old ways would return. An investigation revealed that Theron had trained apprentices before his imprisonment, and one named Nero had escaped capture. Nero was a young vampire of only 150 years who had been radicalized by Theron's ideology and was building a movement called the Purists, with the goal of overthrowing Victor and repealing the Accords and eliminating all hybrids, starting with Mira. The threat materialized when Mira's school was bombed with minor damage and no deaths, but the attack served as a clear message that Nero was coming for what he considered the symbol of everything wrong with vampire society. Victor mobilized forces to hunt Nero, but the young radical proved intelligent and elusive, hiding among human extremists and using them as cover against vampire tracking methods. Clara expressed fear about their inability to protect Mira forever, and argued that their daughter needed to learn to protect herself rather than rely on constant guardianship. Training began with Victor teaching Mira combat techniques adapted from vampire fighting styles to suit her hybrid physiology, while Clara taught strategy and negotiation, and the crucial skill of knowing when to fight and when to talk. Mira learned quickly because her telekinesis gave her advantages in combat, but she hated violence and kept insisting there had to be another way to resolve conflicts. Nero made a mistake and left a digital trail that Victor's team tracked to an abandoned warehouse, and Victor went personally with guards to capture the radical before he could strike again. The warehouse was a trap filled with explosives and silver weapons and magic nullifiers, and Victor was wounded and captured, as Nero revealed he had anticipated the king's personal involvement. Nero planned to execute Victor publicly and broadcast the death to spark a revolution against the hybrid-friendly regime, and he contacted Clara with a ransom demand. Surrender the abomination, and he would release the king, but refuse, and Victor would die, and she had 12 hours to decide. Clara understood that Nero was unstable and would likely kill Victor regardless of what she chose, and when Mira volunteered to trade herself to save her father, Clara refused absolutely. Mira argued that she was stronger than her mother thought and deserved a chance to try, and together they devised a strategy where Mira would offer herself with a hidden tracker so when Nero brought them together, Clara could lead a rescue mission with loyal guards. Mira contacted Nero and agreed to come in exchange for her father's release first. And Nero accepted with arrogance because he believed a 12-year-old girl could not possibly threaten him. The exchange occurred at an abandoned factory where Mira arrived apparently alone while Nero held Victor bound in silver chains that weakened him, and Nero delivered a speech about how Mira was the symbol of everything wrong and a child who should not exist, and he would make an example of her. Mira responded by asking if Nero planned to hurt her or just bore her to death, and his rage triggered an attack that she deflected with telekinesis while focusing on delay rather than victory. Clara burst in with guards and a firefight erupted in chaos, and Victor summoned the willpower to shatter his silver chains despite his weakened state and joined the battle. The family worked as a team with Victor fighting Nero directly, while Clara coordinated guards, and Mira used telekinesis to disarm purists. And when Nero grew desperate, he grabbed Mira as a hostage with a knife to her throat. Mira did not panic but looked Nero in the eyes and used her empathic ability to force him to feel every ounce of pain he had caused, reflecting his victim's terror back into his own consciousness. Nero dropped the knife and collapsed, sobbing and begging her to make it stop, but Mira released him and explained that she could kill him but would not, because she was not what he thought she was. Nero was arrested, and the purist movement collapsed without his leadership. But as they left the factory, Mira whispered to Clara that she had felt all of Nero's pain and asked how people survived that much hate. Mira was shaken by the empathic overload as she processed the trauma of feeling Nero's victims' fear and his self-loathing, and the cycle of trauma creating more trauma. Victor expressed guilt for allowing her to go into danger, insisting she was still a child, but Mira responded with maturity that she was a hybrid and would never be just a child, and her power came with responsibility to use it. Clara sat with Mira and answered her question about surviving hate by explaining that people chose love every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, because hate was easy and fear was easy, but love and trust and hope required real courage. Mira reflected that Nero had been scared underneath the hate, and Clara acknowledged that most hate grew from fear, but that understanding did not excuse the harm, even if it explained the motivation. Nero was tried publicly with cameras broadcasting the proceedings because transparency was essential to maintaining trust, and Victor sentenced him to rehabilitation rather than execution, while declaring that they would break the cycle of violence by choosing mercy. Public opinion divided between those who called Victor weak and those who called him visionary, but the precedent was established that justice mattered more than revenge. Mira testified at the trial and spoke about how Nero hurt people because he was taught to fear her even though she was not scary, but just herself. And she argued that if they kept killing each other for being different, there would be no future, and she wanted a future. Her speech went viral globally as a 12-year-old hybrid called for peace and became a voice for her generation, and the human government invited her to speak at the United Nations. Mira was terrified, but Viktor and Clara supported her, and she addressed world leaders with poise beyond her years, explaining that she had not asked to be a symbol, but if she was one, then let her represent possibility as proof that different did not mean dangerous. She described herself as both vampire and human, and neither vampire nor human, but simply herself, arguing that if she could exist, then peace could exist too. The speech received a standing ovation and inspired treaty proposals that expanded the accords globally. But fame proved exhausting, as Mira was stalked by paparazzi and received death threats and could not go anywhere without guards and missed the possibility of being normal. Mira told Clara that she wanted to leave for a while to see the world and be a kid, and though Clara's heart broke, she understood the need for freedom and growth. Mira, at chronological age 7, appeared 16 and wanted to travel to experience life outside the spire and make her own choices, but Victor resisted with arguments about danger and her status as a target. Mira countered that she would always be a target and could not live in a cage, reminding him that he had taught her that very lesson. Clara supported Mira's position and pointed out that they could not protect her from everything, but could only prepare her for what she would face. They compromised with a supervised journey, where Silas, now captain of the guard and recovered from his wounds, would accompany her for 1 year abroad, with weekly check-ins. Mira planned to visit human cities and vampire courts and werewolf packs to learn all perspectives, and Asher hugged her goodbye and said he would miss her while she blushed and promised to return safely. Victor took Mira to the balcony, where he and Clara had first bonded, and admitted that if anything happened to her, he would not survive it. But Mira assured him that he would survive because Clara had taught him how, and she would be okay. Clara gave Mira a journal with instructions to write her own story rather than the symbol's story, and at dawn, Mira departed while Victor and Clara watched from the spire. Victor feared they might never see her again, but Clara reframed the possibility as evidence that they had raised a daughter capable of choosing her own path, which was success rather than failure. The familial bond, a weaker version of the romantic bond, let them feel that Mira was safe and happy even at a distance. 6 months later, Mira sent letters describing her learning about humans who feared her, and vampires who respected her, and werewolves who accepted her as she grew into herself. 1 year to the day after her departure, Mira returned home changed and more confident, and more at peace, and she ran to Victor and Clara at the spire entrance, declaring she had so much to tell them. 5 years later, Mira was chronologically 12, but appeared 21 and had founded the Bridge Initiative, an organization promoting cross-species understanding and cooperation. Victor abdicated peacefully for real this time, and a new council was elected with half vampire and half human membership, replacing monarchy with democracy. Clara became a professor teaching the next generation of hybrid researchers, while Mira chose not to seek power but became a mediator traveling the world to resolve conflicts, embodying the bridge role Lydia had predicted. Victor and Clara were no longer king and queen, but simply partners and parents who volunteered at the Hybrid Academy and mentored bonded pairs navigating the challenges they had once faced. Victor and Clara and adult Mira stood on the balcony overlooking a vibrant city where humans and vampires and werewolves and hybrids coexisted in imperfect but genuine community. Mira credited them with changing the world, but Clara corrected that they had started the change and Mira's generation would finish it. Victor reflected that when he met Clara, he thought he was claiming her, but was wrong because she freed him, and through that freedom, they freed everyone. The bond was visible between all three as silver threads of love connected them, and Mira observed that she used to hate being different, but now understood that different was not the problem, but rather fear of different was the problem, and they had beaten fear with love, always with love. They turned from the balcony and walked inside together as the door closed behind them, and the city lights glowed, and the world continued forward into the future they had built together.